Well, I'm sure I don't have to tell this group that 2011 is the sesquicentennial of the beginning of the American Civil War. And it is also, of course, the sesquicentennial of the first inauguration of Abraham Lincoln as president. What it is not the sesquicentennial of, however, is Lincoln's first stay at the Lincoln Cottage. I believe that came in 1862, so next year will be the sesquicentennial of his introduction to Lincoln Cottage. But in 1861, reportedly, as they were going to the outgoing president, President Buchanan, told President Lincoln and his wife, you know, it gets awfully hot in Washington, and I found this great place to go up by the Soldiers' Home when it gets hot in Washington in the summer. Remember that. So Lincoln was tipped off about the Soldiers' Home 150 years ago this year. Well, this is also, as Aaron explained, the sesquicentennial of the issuance of the first volume of a series of volumes issued by the U.S. State Department, official volumes, called Foreign Relations of the United States. And I'd like to begin by asking historian Aaron, if you could explain to our group just what is this thing called Foreign Relations of the United States, this series? What kind of documents and stuff does it include?
Sure. Well, as you would expect, your series has evolved and changed a lot over the past century and a half. We've all been practicing the word sesquicentennial, but occasionally a century and a half. Today, what we do is document the foreign policy making process, and so we will publish memoranda, telegrams, intelligence reports, any number of variety of documents that will help people today understand how foreign policy in the past was made. Right now our office is publishing volumes on the Nixon and Ford administration, so we're operating 3 or 4 decades behind events. The reason you're all here tonight, however, is for this first volume here in Lincoln's time, which was much, much different. This volume came out 150 years ago on Saturday, on December 3rd, and included documents that were as young as 2 or 3 weeks, close to the end of November. And these are almost exclusively instructions from Washington out to our various posts, and then the dispatches back from those posts to Washington. So we don't have a lot of, in this volume, foreign policy formulation. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about how the decision-making in Washington took place. But what we do have are the fruits of that decision-making, sort of the instructions that went out, and then the response that came back.
Okay, thank you. Well, why 1861? Why didn't this series start like in 1848 or later in 1900? Well, why in 1861?
Well, that's a great question. As it turns out, this volume, one of the things that we feel it represents very well is the balance of powers between the different branches of our government. And so the executive branch is tasked with carrying out foreign policy, but the legislative branch has, of course, the right to check up on the executive branch. And that's exactly what happened in 1861 with this publication. In the summer of 1861, Congress was becoming very concerned that the Confederacy, fledgling though it was going to try to get recognition from foreign powers and use its economic position to try to get recognition. And so Congress set a series of resolutions, 3 different resolutions, all essentially asking the same thing. Were passed in July of 1861, saying to the Lincoln administration, we want to see all of the documents that demonstrate what your State Department is doing to prevent this from happening. Now, this process of requesting material from the executive branch has a very long history. It's happened throughout the early republic. We found examples of this going back to Washington's presidency. So that process of requesting information is very old. What's new for the first time in this volume, and then sort of serves as a pivot, and which is why we mark our anniversary to this date, is that prior to this time, all of these requests had been very ad hoc. And so there would be a specific treaty with one country, and so they would ask to see documents relating to that treaty. It would be very, very limited in scope, very ad hoc, related to very small specific events. In these resolutions in 1861, Congress said, we want to see everything that you're doing across the globe. We want to know exactly what is happening to prevent the Confederates from gaining recognition. And so for the first time, all of these documents were collected under one cover. And then the other thing that happened in 1861 that represented a new shift was that the publication became annualized. They didn't know that when this volume came out, but we now know that over time, Congress stopped having to ask every single time they wanted something. The State Department just naturally started putting out every year.
Okay, so do we know who put this together? Did Secretary of State Seward personally get involved, or even the President?
We don't know, unfortunately, too much about the clerks or the men who put it together. But we can make some intelligent guesses based on other things we know about the department. The Department of State was very small. In 1860, there were 42 domestic employees for the entire Department of State. That's actually, I don't know if I should say this, but that's actually smaller than the number of people who currently work in the office of the historian. So the department was a very, very small operation in 1860. And the documents that are published, drawn from all over the world and speak to our relations with very important countries as well as some minor ones. And so, while on the one hand, we have no direct documentary evidence of Seward's involvement, for example, it's impossible for me to conceive that something like this could have happened without him knowing about it. One, the department was just too small, and second of all, the documents in here are just too important. The task was too great.
Well, given Seward's reputation of his personality, I'm sure he tried to make sure that there was as many documents as possible with the name Seward at the end. But
I did an excellent job.
But do we know what kind of documents, how documents were selected for this volume? And could you kind of contrast how documents were selected in 1861 with how historians select documents today from the current?
Okay.
How has the procedure changed?
Well, let me start by talking about what happens today. Today our series is, we go to essentially presidential administration by administration. And every time we embark on a new administration, our staff gets together, we decide what topics we want these volumes to be about. We have a panel of experts appointed by the secretary called our Historical Advisory Committee, with whom we consult to make sure that we're covering everything of historical significance. And then we have trained historians who go out and do extensive research in federal archives, presidential libraries, national archives, various other places around Washington. They select the documents that they want to print on their topic, and then we go through the process of getting those declassified and published. None of those elements of the national security apparatus were obviously there in 1861, and so the process for them was much different. First of all, the types of documents they had to select from were much, much smaller. Everything that's published here is communication between Washington and the posts abroad. And then second of all, they just didn't have to wait as long for this material to come out. So one of the ways in which this series has evolved is that instead of being sort of in-the-moment reportage, it's evolved to become a historical look at American foreign policy.
Well, you say Congress sort of asked for this. How did they react when this came out, and how did the U.S. public react to it?
Well, I think Congress's reaction was quite positive. We know that for a couple of reasons. One, they didn't stop asking for it. They continued to accept it every year when it came out. And one of the main reasons, or I'd say one of the main ways that we know about the reaction, is debates over funding for the printing of the series. And so when the original book that came out 150 years ago printed about 1,000 copies. By 1864, Congress was debating whether or not they should be spending money on 10,000 copies of the series. And so clearly they saw, at least in my view, that the series had value as a public relations measure, as a way to spread information about what the country was doing. And that's, I mean, 10,000 far exceeds the number of foreign posts we had, or the number of congressmen, or anything. And so clearly they wanted to get this into a lot of people's hands. For the American public, the proxy that we've been using in our office to understand the reaction has been newspaper coverage. And there was an anticipation about the volume coming out. If you look at newspapers in December of 1861, this is only, at that point, a couple of weeks after the Trent Affair. And so sort of this major blow up in international relations.
But that wasn't covered.
That's correct. That's correct. And so there was anticipation that it would be, and so there was definitely reporting about it before it came out. And then after it came out, we can trace interest in the volume through newspapers up and down the East Coast, and eventually over west by January of 1862 to California, by looking at the excerpts that they printed. And so there were newspapers in large cities, obviously New York, Baltimore, here in Washington, but also smaller cities in New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and eventually out in California, that printed not only excerpts, but sort of glowing reviews of how they felt that this was a positive sign of how our foreign relations were operating.
Well, as you know, today many diplomatic messages to posts in the field and from the post back to Washington are classified, secret or confidential. They're classified so that our diplomats abroad can speak frankly, can report frankly about their host governments, and I don't think I'm giving anything away when I say that sometimes they report very frankly indeed. But here, that's why you're only now working on documents 30 years ago. But this is all contemporary stuff. Did any of our posts abroad, the ministers object and say, wait a minute, why did you publish what I wrote about Lord Palmerston or something like that?
Yes, we do actually have some complaints, records of some complaints from our ministers abroad. And it's actually, I'm very glad that they did complain, because what those complaints do is give us insight into what Seward thought about the series, when Seward responded to those complaints. And so in 1864, Charles Francis Adams, who was in London, complained that certain of his dispatches had been published in the volume for 1863, and he felt that the way in which these were published sort of gave an incomplete picture of the job that he was doing, and made it look bad in front of the British. And so he complained, why didn't you, if you're going to publish this, why didn't you publish everything else that at least makes me look like I know what I'm doing? And so Seward gave a very comprehensive response to that, and it's from that response that we have some insight into the value that the administration placed in this series. Seward responded on a couple of different levels. He said essentially that the president had a duty in a democracy to communicate what the government is doing to the people, that the power of the government comes from the people, thus the people have a right to know what's going on. And the way that they're going to do that is through publishing these documents. And so it's, so on the one hand, I guess the first point is that this publication is not going to stop. We're going to keep doing this regardless of what you think. Then Seward laid out the two circumstances under which he felt that documents would be withheld from publication. One of those was if a document would affect an ongoing negotiation with a foreign power. He said if time came to publish that and we were still in negotiation about something, then we wouldn't do it. And the second reason that they wouldn't publish something would be if a document would embarrass a foreign government. And he said, essentially to Adams, this letter that you're complaining about doesn't meet either one of those bars, and so, and the president, or more importantly, has an obligation to communicate this material to the people. So we're going to do it. So yes, people did complain, but it didn't do any good.
But it sounds like from what you're saying that Seward actually was basing the issuance of these documents on the constitutional structure of the government. He's going to base it on the Constitution.
Right. So the president has an obligation in Article 2 to basically tell the people what's going on in the country. Right now, we would think of that as the State of the Union address. But so the root for this, you're right, absolutely right, does come from the Constitution. And at least in the argument that Seward was making.
Did we ever get any objections from the foreign governments that documents that were published, at least during the Civil War?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any, and it never sort of the threatened, if you publish this, it will ruin our relationship, and I'll never be able to speak to them again. That sort of never comes to pass. No one shut off obligations, relations. No one said, well, now I'm going over to the Confederacy, and it didn't seem, if any complaints didn't rise to the level of actually having a real impact on foreign relations.
Are the documents all published in whole, or have they been edited? Some parts taken out for perhaps diplomatic reasons?
Yes, this is actually another interesting difference between then and now, and one where I think I can fairly confidently say we do better than what they did in 1861. If you look at the documents in this volume, some of them have been edited. I mean, there are sort of two levels of editing going on here. First level of editing, of course, is that not every document ever generated can be published, and so at some point there was a selection process. And unfortunately, we don't know what that is. Today, our selection process is more or less encoded in law. We have an obligation in the law that governs our series to be thorough, accurate, and reliable. It is a subjective measure, but it is nevertheless something which historians can talk about. The second type of editing that happened is that not all of the documents that were published in their entirety. The good news is that the National Archives in College Park still has the originals, both the material that was generated in Washington and copies of the material that was generated abroad. And so one of the things that we've done in this project, as we've been studying our own past in this sesquicentennial year, is to go to NARA and pull the documents off the shelf and try to determine what they cut. And so, although we don't know, we don't have any policy statement from them sort of laid out, we can try to reverse engineer what their thinking was by looking at the material that was cut out of these documents. And what we found is that there are a couple different categories of material that was cut out. First category is almost completely innocuous, at least in my view. I mean, a lot of these documents would start out by saying, okay, these are the ones we've received your letters from this time, and so just sort of so you know we've got them. And that sort of stuff is cut, and I don't think there's any real damage to the historical record if what you're after is foreign policy information by knowing too much about that. Some of the other things that they left out are a bit more interesting. We've taken a look at the documents from London, and some of the things that have been left out of Adams's correspondence are information about who his contacts were within Parliament, where he was getting his information, sort of royal gossip about the Queen's health, that sort of thing, which might, I mean, again, that doesn't necessarily bear on foreign relations, but might make it a bit more difficult for Adams to do his job if this stuff came out. And we do know, incidentally, that these did get back to Europe. So, I mean, that was an actual possibility. I think the most interesting category of material, at least to me, of what got cut out, was Adams talking about the sort of state of the British mind and what they thought about the Civil War. There's one document where Adams has a very long commentary where he divides the British populace into these different categories in terms of what they might think about the war effort. And so you have abolitionists who actually want there to be two separate countries because they're worried that the North might fold and hold on to slavery if it meant staying with the South. So you actually have a category of people who opposed slavery but were okay with the war ending in two separate countries because they wouldn't want the North to accede to keeping slavery. You've got another category of people who essentially don't care which way it goes as long as the cotton keeps flowing. And then you've got another category of people who would be delighted to see the Republican experiment fail completely, because thus demonstrating that the American Revolution was a mistake and all these other things. And so this was all left out of the version printed in the book. And so we don't know why, but it's not I think a bad guess to say that this might have been too demoralizing or toxic to be printed at the time. These books also ended up in the South, and I think that would have made, obviously been great headline material for the Richmond or New Orleans newspapers had that type of material gotten out. There was another example. I'll give you one more example on this, and then I'll stop talking about it. But it's great stuff. Right after the Battle of Bull Run, Adams reports back that he needs to lay low for a little while because essentially the Union performance militarily was so embarrassing that no one is going to take him seriously if he goes in and complains about the blockade or what have you. And so again, this is something else that was you won't find it here. You have to go to College Park. And again, I think that's an example of something where would have been embarrassing, would have been great fodder for Southern newspapers, and so we don't know precisely why they took it out, but it's not hard to imagine how damaging it might have been. And it also leavens, for all of Seward's soaring rhetoric about, democracy and the people and all this sort of thing, there were still hard political decisions in all of this about what to believe. So, thanks for letting me go on about that.
Sure. Basically, they took out anything that might cause Queen Victoria to say, "We are not amused."
Yes. Just briefly, a couple of the more specific issues. On April 19th, of course, President Lincoln issued a proclamation of blockade of the southern coast. Now, the United States Navy had fewer than 50 warships at this time in commission. Most of those were on foreign stations. It would take months to get back to the United States. So the blockade was what they call a paper blockade at first. It really wasn't an effective blockade. Did any foreign power like Great Britain or France object to the blockade proclamation and say this really wasn't, this is silly, we're going to disregard this? Yeah, the material about this type of topic that comes through in the volume, again, I think is a good illustration of how things are different today than they were in 1861. Today, we would, the historians in our office would look at that type of topic and then sort of go after material that would demonstrate how this policy sort of came about. And what we have here, I think, is more of a, I don't want to make it sound too cheap, but essentially a public relations measure where when you look at the documents in this volume, it demonstrates our ministers' complaint, essentially, to other countries who have allowed Confederate ships to go to their ports. And so it's more of a the documents in this volume are more of a demonstration where, see, look, we're doing the best we can to complain about these things when they happen, even if we can't prevent them. So that's the type of documentation that comes through in this volume.
Speaking of complaints, of course, one of the reactions of Great Britain and France both to to the blockade proclamation was to issue proclamations of neutrality. They were going to be neutral as between the Confederacy and the United States. What does this tell us about how Seward and the ministers overseas reacted to that post-proclamation?
Well, there's a nice document here from Adams where essentially he says he went to the foreign ministry, complained about this, and they essentially brushed him off. And it's like, we listen to, the Poles come in, the Hungarians come in, the Italians come in. We listen to everybody, but it doesn't mean that we recognize them. So Adams had to be satisfied with this neutrality that was not exactly full recognition, but was obviously more than they would have wanted.
Okay. Let's see. How are we doing on time?
Great, so we can take some questions.
Okay. Let me just make a couple more questions. One is, has this series proceeded uninterrupted since 1861? Have there been gaps in the record?
It's basically been interrupted. I think there was a small hiccup in the 1880s where a volume may not have come out, but the very next volume included material from the previous year. So the shelf won't be beautifully every single year, but the coverage has always been complete.
And my final question, as a historian going through this material, was there anything that surprised you? Was there something that you learned that you didn't expect?
I think the material that surprised me the most was the material on slavery in the volume itself. The Civil War, over time, of course, became a war for emancipation, but what historians say about Civil War foreign relations essentially makes the point that neither North nor South, at the beginning of the war, wanted to give the impression that the war was about slavery. And so I sort of took that as face value, but once you get into the documents, there's actually a great deal about slavery in the volume. Seward blames the war explicitly on slavery, or actually more appropriately on the slave power, the sort of inordinate amount of federal power that slaveholders had in the federal system. And then our ministers to several of these countries abroad are not shy at all about making the point. The minister to the Netherlands says if we had no slavery, there would be no war. Our minister to Spain said that essentially, all those filibusters who were trying to take over Cuba in the 1850s, it's the same problem, trying to get the Spanish to come over to their side. And so the documents are actually very forthright about the role that slavery played in causing the Civil War. And so as I'm trying to balance that with the reading that I had done up to that point, I think the way to make those two things coincide, the sort of standing interpretation and what I was reading here, is that distinction about sort of the war becoming a war for emancipation, but the slave power had always been at the root, cause. And so that's what they were identifying here, even if, because there is no real talk in the volume about emancipation.
Not yet.
Right.
But they recognize that there was this at the foundation of the whole problem of slavery. That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely.